in mass and pain. Blood runs like the rain. Evil finds its way in the spine-chilling fray. Out of print, but not out of mind. Horror digs, don't look behind. Feel the terror creep. Will you dare to sleep? I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night.
Freddy Krueger's 7 Sweetest Dreams. Dead Highways, Lost Roads. A fairy tale written in blood on a dead man's back. By Philip Nutman. For Graham Humphreys. Welcome to my nightmare. The needle hit the vein. The plunger pressed, and he felt the familiar sensation of something alien entering his system, racing up his arm toward his brain, and the battle began again. The chattering voices started to scream like the kittens when he'd set fire to the sack. It's always the same, no matter what they tried to do. Shoot him full of shit, zap him with est, beat him. It never made the voices go away. Sleep was worse. The nightmares were more vivid than the world around him. Their widescreen technicolor images, more succulent than prison food. The pain real. Even banging his head against the wall. "Sweet dreams, motherfucker," said a rich black voice. Then he was on the roller coaster going down, down into the fetid pool of his subconscious. He was killing her again. His fist came down in a vicious arc, and the bitch's teeth flew from her mouth as the crowbar connected with jawbone. A shriek tried to erupt from her torn lips, but died, gurgling in her throat. He laughed. "Take away my happiness. Take it away? Now you suffer. Now it's your turn." He punched her stomach. She retched, and he laughed again. A second punch. A third. A second blow with the iron bar, this time across her back, shattering vertebrae with a satisfying crunch. He laughed and cried. Tears of pain, of rage, of happiness. Then he jerked his wrist, opening the 3 blades, and gutted his wife. "I'm sure as shit glad they're gonna fry that fucker tomorrow," Lindsay said as he fired up a Marlboro. "And not before time," Florescu replied, picking his teeth with the matchbook cover. "That's one son of a bitch deserves to suffer when he goes. Hell, I'd like to wire up that bastard's dick and give him a few thousand volts through the nuts after what he did to those women." "Don't remind me, man. Makes me want to puke." Lindsay looked in through the 2-inch thick rectangle of plexiglass set high into the maximum security cell's steel door, at the sleeping figure on the bed inside. Moonlit fell through the tiny window situated on the far wall, giving the Spartan room a deceptive air of tranquility. "Look at that little fucker, sleeping like a baby. Fucker sleeps better than I do." "Yeah, well, tomorrow Carl Stolenberg can let it R.I.P. "Yeah, rest in pieces, motherfucker, just like your victims." The 2 guards laughed and slapped each other on the back as they sauntered down the secure wing hall of the Madison Correctional Facility. It was 9:55 p.m., and in 5 minutes they were off duty. Time to hit Salmon's Ale House on the way home and kill a few brews before bed. But there was a hollowness to their levity. Florescu thought, realizing he was laughing a little louder than was necessary. Hell, there was nothing funny about a serial killer who'd carved up 257 people over 15 years. Nothing funny at all. He was a child again. That was when the fear came. A cancerous animal with razor teeth and rancid tongue, clawing his head, scrabbling at his eyes, its pukey breath filling his nostrils, as Mama took the iron and placed it on his leg. It wasn't fair. It was always the same dream, just like having a VCR and only one tape to play. The first scene with his ex-wife was fun. That was Three Stooges stuff. Oops, sorry, honey, just poked you in the eye with my knife. And the reruns of his victims, mowing them down in the Trans Am, gutting them with his blades, spreading their entrails across the highway like red ticker tape. That was exciting. Until the screaming started. The constant scream of 257 people, men, women, but no children, all screaming for vengeance in one long, high-pitched feedback of pain. But when Mama opened his bedroom door with the iron in her hand, he was the one who screamed the loudest. Alice Seagal's eyes began to flutter beneath her lids as her mind started to ski down the slope of consciousness into REM sleep. In the spill of moonlight angling through the window of the duplex situated a block away from the Elm Street Mall, she looked like a pre-Raphaelite heroine, Rossetti's Ophelia, floating under clear water, her hair spread out on the pillow in an uneven fan. She had a delicate bone structure that belied her inner strength, but as the dream unraveled behind her eyes she murmured, and the scared girl she'd once been emerged, trying to run away from the night terrors lying in wait. "Off with her head!" the Red Queen screamed. "But your Majesty," the White Armadillo objected, its voice a cringing whine, "we can't kill her. He wants her." The Red Queen shouted in rage, the color of her face matching that of her ceremonial robes. "I don't care what he wants. She's mine. Give me the blade." The Armadillo bowed and handed her the machete. "But your Majesty, I haven't done anything," Alice cried. "Shut up, bitch! You remind me of my wife. That's all the justification I need." Alice felt confused. "Surely you mean husband, your Majesty?" she questioned. "And I'm a girl." The Red Queen pulled off the auburn wig, revealing the military-style crew cut beneath, and Alice laughed. She was a man. Then the chamber began to quiver like it was in the grip of an earthquake, and the Armadillo fell over. Only it wasn't a regal chamber anymore. It was a department store, and the courtiers were mannequins. Flames licked suddenly at the walls, and heat radiated like bad breath from the burning fixtures. "Up! Wake up!" "What? Wake up, Alice!" "Steve? Wake up!" Hands reached out from the wall of fire in front of her, and Alice screamed. In a place where nothing human lived, something stirred. The dream pool was black as pitch, its surface as still as a mirror. But there was no light here, only darkness. The darkness of lost dreams, of dead hopes, left to putrefy in a maze of rotting aspirations, a nest of nightmares. A tiny ripple creased the pool's surface, then another, subtle waves radiating from the center. A third followed, and a fourth, each increasing in size, until the pool was choppy, like a boating pond before a storm descends upon a children's park. A head broke the surface, whispering a name. "Alice," it crooned. "It ain't over till the red bitch sings." The voice gave a wet chuckle, and the head, a furrowed bald cranium crisscrossed with scar tissue, sank below the surface of the dream pool. A thin trail of bubbles marking its descent into the Stygian blackness. Mama placed the burning metal on his leg, and he wet himself as the pain lanced his fragile sanity. Only it wasn't Mama anymore. It was the ugly man, the man with the pizza face. "Come to Uncle Frederick, Carl," Pizza Face said. "Come to me." In his cell in Madison Correctional Facility, Carl Stolenberg, a.k.a. Roadkill, opened his eyes and bit his tongue to stifle the shriek in his throat. Drugs or no drugs, Interstate 35's Angel of Death was not going to sleep tonight. "I was heading for the bathroom when I heard you scream," Steve said, but Alice wasn't listening. Her attention was on the fluorescent glow of the Elm Street Mall down the block, its postmodern angles and affront to the quiet, restrained suburban architecture of what remained of the old neighborhood. From the window she could see where her old house had once stood, the place where her nightmares had started 7 years ago. At the turn of the century, all this was farmland, she thought hazily, the tattered shroud of the dream still clinging to her shoulders. Once, this was a nice place to live, but that was long gone. A man called Freddy Krueger had seen to that. A twisted man who had lured little children down into a boiler room to torture and murder them. Even once he died, burned to death at the hands of his victims' parents. The killing had continued. But that was a story she didn't want to think about right now, not with the other dreams still holding on to the shadows of her bedroom. The town fathers felt building a mall on Elm Street and its environs was the best thing to do, considering the street's history and the declining property prices. So much for progress, she thought. A monument to evil was still a monument to evil, however you dressed it up, and the temple of consumerism sitting at the end of the street certainly qualified in its ugliness. You listening to me? Sorry. She turned to face her husband. Poor Steve. He'll never understand. I said, what were you dreaming about? He rubbed his tired blue eyes and replaced his wireframe glasses, his biceps bulging against the fabric of his t-shirt. He'd been working out for 6 months now, and lifting weights 3 times a week was paying off. Was it really that short of a space of time? It seemed longer. One really strange morning she'd woken up and rolled over to hug him, and in the first blur of sleepy thought she'd done a double take, thinking she was beside Dan. Dear Dan. She still missed her high school sweetheart. A cold, hard fact. Steve sensed it. She knew, even if he never voiced the feeling. Perhaps that's why he'd started working out. But trying to compete with a dead man was a losing game. Shit, Alice, I give up. Either tell me or don't. I'm going back to sleep. Steve pulled back the sheets as he looked away from her, not wanting to show the mixture of hurt and frustration ingraining itself into his face. He rolled into bed, turning his back toward her. Are you coming? In a while. Okay. He switched off the bedside lamp, and shadows raced across the carpet toward her feet, like faithful pets that followed her wherever she went. Even on the sunniest days, the darkness was never far away, which was why she could never leave Elm Street. She turned back to the window and the view of the mall. Her situation reminded her of a horror movie she'd once seen. In it, a New York brownstone was the gateway to hell, and there was this old blind priest who was a guardian to ensure that evil never escaped. He'd been played by some old actor whose name she could never remember, John something or other, and the movie had really creeped her out. But that had been long before the events that had changed her life, and she'd discovered who she really was. The mall glowed obscenely in the darkness, and if she stood at an angle she could just see the corner of the Argento Cinema's marquee. The triplex was showing Night of the Living Dead, Cape Fear, and The Silence of the Lambs. All were movies about killers and death, but horror films and thrillers held no appeal for her. Nothing Hollywood dreamed up could compete with the real horrors she had experienced, or the true evil lurking on Elm Street, against which she stood guard. Well, there was no point standing up all night. She had a lot to do come morning, and she should try to rest. But Alice sensed she wouldn't rest easy that night. There was a subtle trace of electricity in the air, like that first hint of ozone before a storm. Something was coming, something new, deadly, and she realized her arms were covered in goosebumps as she wrapped them around her chest, trying to suppress a sudden shiver. Alice slipped into bed beside Steve and snuggled up against his broad back. She closed her eyes and prayed for a dreamless sleep. Blue Highway. Carl Stolenberg lay on the metal cot, cocooned in his straitjacket, his eyes staring sightlessly up at the white padded ceiling as Ray Floresu and Les Lindsay entered the room, shackles in hand. Each man was armed with a handgun and a heavy baton, yet neither felt safe this close to the killer. Even the other 2 prison guards standing in the doorway with shotguns cradled in their arms were cold comfort as far as Floresu was concerned. "Sit up, Stolenberg," Lindsay said, his deep voice masking his apprehension. Roadkill continued to stare at the ceiling. His eyelids were still as granite, and a chill stroked Floressu's spine. We might as well be a couple of stuffed chickens for all the notice he takes of us, he thought. God, this bastard gives me the creeps. "Come on, you son of a bitch, get up! Time to fry, motherfucker!" The room was so silent you could hear a mouse fart. Floressu ran his tongue over his dry lips and lifted the ankle chains in front of him. "Hey, Roadkill, look what we got for you." His voice sounded hollow in his ears, the smug bravado as empty as a discarded Doritos bag. The killer continued to lie there, his chest hardly rising and falling as he breathed inaudibly. One of the guards in the hallway, Buddy Newton, another regular at Salmon's, cleared his throat and shifted the weight of the gun in his arms. "Come on, you assholes, we ain't got all day." "Keep your wig on, man," Lindsay shot back. "Can't you see our guest is playing possum?" "Fuck this shit, get those chains on him, man." Floressu turned from Newton to look at Lindsay. "Who's going to do it, you or me?" "Hell, you do it. I don't want to touch that son of a bitch," Lindsay growled. Floressu shrugged, moved to the cot, placing the shackles on the floor. "Come on, we can do this the hard way or the easy way." Roadkill shifted his eyes from the ceiling to the guard's pale face, blinked once, then sat up. "Good boy," Lindsay said. Roadkill looked at him, and the tall man felt his balls contract like a hooker with cold hands had just touched his most sensitive spot. "Spare me the patronizing bullshit." His voice was a light falsetto, underscored with a trace of Texan drawl, belying the rough-hewn, weather-beaten toughness of his broken features. Once, not so many years ago, Stolenberg had been good-looking. Floressu had noted. His high cheekbones, full mouth, and strong jawline were almost movie star-like in their construction, and the blue of his eyes was the shade that made women wet when they looked at Paul Newman. Well, that's what Roadkill's right side reminded him of anyway. The left was a different matter. The cheekbone had been shattered and was now a misshapen lump, over which a long, jagged scar ran from temple to mouth, pulling the lips up in a permanent grimace that was pure horror show. In his 10 years as a prison guard, he'd seen some ugly bastards, but Roadkill won the Oscar for most evil performance hands down. Floressu picked up the shackles and bent down to attach them to the killer's feet. He hated being this close to the guy. Roadkill radiated a preternatural coldness, like he was already dead, and actually touching the guy took all his courage. Fortunately, the killer did not resist, his eye line staring off into the middle distance. "Okay, Stolenberg, time to go," he said, and the killer obediently stood. "I want to piss," Stolenberg muttered. "You'll piss all right," Newton snapped from the doorway. "Once they zap you with 50,000 votes, you'll piss like there's no tomorrow. Only there ain't gonna be no tomorrow for you." The other guard, Jimmy Danewood, snickered. "I know my rights. I can piss." "You can piss your fucking pants, that's all," Newton growled. "Here, hold 'em a minute," he said to Floressu and Lindsay. "What?" A frown creased Lindsay's brow. "Hold him. I got a little going-away present." Newton handed his shotgun to Danewood, then moved toward the killer. "Hold him or he's—" Newton brought the ham-hock of his right fist up in a vicious uppercut, belting Roadkill in the sternum. "Gonna fall!" The killer dropped to his knees as air rushed from his lungs. "Buddy, don't—" "Can it, Floressu? I've been waiting a long time for this." Newton swung his right foot into the downed man's stomach, and Roadkill folded up, hitting the padded floor with a satisfying whack, a wet patch appearing at the crotch of his prison overalls. Alice Segal sipped her second cup of coffee of the day and looked across the kitchen table at Steve, who was engrossed in the newspaper. The shadows beneath her eyes indicated she hadn't slept well. Although she'd not been plagued by other dreams, her sleep had been fitful and restless, so much so she'd gotten up at around 4 a.m. to lie on the couch so as not to disturb Steve, who had a meeting with some financial bigwigs this morning. Regardless of the fact, neither usually said much in the mornings, even when her son Jacob was present. The silence between them indicated Steve was still annoyed about last night. Judging by his manner, he was more than annoyed. Royally pissed was the phrase that came to mind. "Could you pass the butter?" she said, picking up a slice of whole wheat toast. Steve complied silently, not looking up from the paper. "Thanks." After 3 years of marriage, she was starting to resent his immature moodiness and lack of respect for her feelings. He was a good man, a kind, hard-working husband, and a decent father to Jacob, even if the boy was not his own flesh and blood. And she accepted she was not an easy woman to live with. Oh, she was the dutiful wife, but he could not come to terms with her silence concerning events in the past. It wasn't that she hadn't tried to explain, but how could you explain psychic powers and the dream reality to the pragmatic mind of a realtor who had little imagination and saw the world in terms of profit and loss, black and white? You couldn't, and she wondered now if their marriage had been a mistake. But that was a disquieting truth to face, and she pushed the thought away. The main bone of contention between them was her insistence on staying in the house on what was left of Elm Street, when they had the money to move to a larger, more luxurious place on the affluent side of town. Steve seemed to take it as a slur on his manhood. She sensed he felt that no matter what he did for her and the boy, it would never be good enough, which wasn't true. She loved him and appreciated the security he'd brought into their lives. God, she needed it after Dan's horrible death and the trauma of a cesarean birth, being an unwed mother at age 19 with only an alcoholic father to look after her and the baby. But the simple fact was he would never understand, couldn't understand, even if he tried. She looked at the clock. It was 8:35. She'd better get moving if she was going to get to the rehabilitation clinic on time. Her father was not a patient man at the best of times, and the last thing he'd appreciate was waiting around on the morning of his release from the clinic. "You'll be late, darling," she said, considering the toast and deciding she had no appetite. Steve put down the paper and shrugged. "There's no hurry. The meeting's not until 10. "Well, I've got to get moving." "How long is he going to be here?" "Wednesday." "Oh, come on. I thought he was just going to stay until Monday morning." Steve was now wearing his exasperated expression. Since Jacob had gone to stay with Yvonne in Wisconsin, and the time alone they had been looking forward to for so long had soured because of the weird dreams she'd been having, he seemed to have 3 expressions: concerned, exasperated, and pissed. Mr. Romantic Lover Man appeared to have gone on permanent vacation, which made Alice even less inclined to let him get close. "What's 5 days?" she said. "He's my father, and I haven't seen him in a month. We've seen your family twice in the last 3 weeks. "Well, my parents aren't alcoholics and don't keep checking themselves into Springwood's equivalent of the Betty Ford Clinic every goddamn 5 minutes. Alice slammed her cup down. "That's not fair. At least he's trying." Steve scowled, and for an instant she felt like throwing coffee dregs all over his blue and white Brooks Brothers shirt. All right, I'm sorry." That was below the belt. Dad, sadly, was another area that made Steve uncomfortable. They'd tried to get along, and Dennis Johnson had made friendly overtures to him. But Steve had a hard time respecting Dad because of his alcoholism. She could understand. Steve came from a solid, functional family in which the only crisis was making a decision on where they were going for vacation each year. Having a lush for a father-in-law was not something he knew how to deal with. "You really... Oh!" She threw up her hands in frustration. "Honey, I'm sorry. I don't. Just... If you can't be nice... She sighed. Steve's face dropped, and he switched to concerned mode. "Well, I guess that's an improvement. Expression number 3, the concerned husband," she thought. Forget it, Steve. I'm tired." He frowned, one eyebrow raised like a lopsided question mark. She put down her coffee cup, pulled the sash tighter on her robe, and stood up. Sulk if you want, she thought, but I don't have to deal with it, and headed upstairs to the shower. The vehicle looked like a truncated school bus, only it was painted slate gray instead of regulation yellow, and was armor-plated with thick steel mesh covering the windows. But at least we're outside, Ray Floresu thought, as he and the other guards exited the main block in a 2x2 formation, with Stallenberg limping between them. "All aboard for the Electric Chair Express! Have your tickets ready and have a nice day." Spending 8 hours a day cooped up in the prison with 200 rapists, psychos, junkies, and assorted scumbags took its toll on your nerves after a while. Like Lindsay was fond of saying, we're the real prisoners here, not these assholes. They've got TVs, drugs, sex, and never have to cook. This place is a fucking hotel compared to living in a one-room apartment and eating TV dinners. Shit, most of them don't even have to do their own laundry. He saw Les's point, but had no desire to suck dick or have his asshole stretched to the size of a baseball by some bull of a cellmate. Give me liberty or give me death. Right on, Patrick, he thought, and death was the next step for jolly old Carl Stollenberg, all right. The guard standing by the rear of the bus opened the heavy door as they drew near, a big shit-eating grin on his face. It was a sentiment shared by all of them. Roadkill was going to fry, and that was one less sick son of a bitch to worry about. Still, it was cold comforts if you believed the FBI's estimation that there were 350 serial killers running rampant across America. "What's the matter, piss your pants?" the door guard chuckled. "Nah, he's just excited about having the biggest orgasm of his life," Lindsay quipped as he climbed into the bus, and the other man laughed. "Dying times here," Floresu added as he stepped up into the vehicle. "Come on, get in, asshole," Newton growled, kicking Stallenberg in the seat of the pants. He climbed in, his expression meat locker cold. "Have a nice trip," the door guard said, and Newton grinned. Once Danewood was inside, the guard locked the door and pounded on the metal. "Take it away, guys." The driver, a small balding guy who'd been with the prison for more years than most of the other guards could remember, stuck his head out the window and nodded, turning over the ignition. The engine rumbled into life, sending a thick cloud of carbon monoxide across the yard, and the bus rolled toward the double set of gates. It was 9:07 a.m. Alice opened the red Subaru's door and slipped into the driver's seat, a touch of sweat on her brow. 9:15 a.m. and it was already 75 degrees. She noted as she clipped the safety belt across her chest. Yes, it was going to be one hell of a hot day, which probably meant Dad was going to be irritable. "Please, God, let it be a day of peace," she said as she checked her makeup in the rearview mirror. A faint buzzing pulled her attention away, droning louder as something flew past her ear, startling her. Alice swatted the insect away and returned her attention to her mascara. The insect buzzed her again. "Great," she moaned. All she needed was a mosquito bite to bring her out in a rash. "Sorry, dude, you picked the wrong babe to tango with." She pulled a folded map from the door pocket and swatted the insect, splattering it against the windshield. She replaced the map, complete with bug traces, and returned her attention to the mirror. Satisfied with her reflection, she inserted the key into the ignition and turned over the engine, then placed a classical tape into the tape deck and put the Subaru in gear. The car had moved but 5 feet when she was forced to slam on the brakes as a radio-controlled Model Red Trans Am sped in front of the Subaru. "Damn it!" She slammed her hand down on the horn, shattering the still of the morning, and turned to look over at the house next door. One of the Jankowitz twins, she could never tell them apart, sniggered and pointed at her as his brother manipulated the control box and sent the car into reverse and into their driveway. Though she generally liked children, the Jankowitz twins were the bane of Alice's life. The fat little snots were always picking on Jacob, or generally up to no good. Halloween was the worst time, and Steve had thrown a fit after last year's escapade when they had left a stuffed armadillo on the porch. Though she couldn't help laughing at the memory, it had been funny watching a grown man scream as he opened the door to pick up the morning paper and come face to face with the ugly little critter. "You brats deserve a good spanking, and if your parents weren't such a pain in the ass, I'd be tempted to give you one," she said and grimaced, with neighbors like the Jankowitzes, who needed enemies. The boys, identically dressed in blue surfing shorts, red Life's a Beach tees, and white Reeboks, snickered at Alice, and one of them discreetly gave her the finger. Such charming manners for a 10-year-old, she thought, and engaged the clutch, pulling out of the drive to head down the street and past the mall. Van Buren Highway encircled the city of Springwood from west to east in a smooth curve. Since the Madison Correctional Facility was situated on one side and the state prison 50 miles away on the other, the bus and its passengers had a 90-minute journey ahead of them. Or at least it should have been, were it not for a detour at exit 7. Due to a bad batch of concrete, a long section of the route was closed to eastbound traffic, and all vehicles had to take the off-ramp onto Junction Avenue, so named because it ran north to south through Springwood, connecting most of the main thoroughfares that bisected the city. Marty Ballin, the old balding driver, cursed under his breath as he swung the bus off the highway and onto Junction. Damn it, the detour was going to add at least 20 minutes to the journey, judging by the traffic conditions. Still, you look at it as it comes. "Where are we going?" Newton called out from the vehicle's rear. "Detour. Gotta bypass the exit." Lindsay jabbed the killer in the ribs. "Looks like you might just be late for your own funeral." Danewood burst out laughing. Floresu and Newton smiled. Roadkill ignored them, his mind elsewhere as he looked out the window. The bus headed down Junction Avenue toward Van Sant, and the route that would take them back to the highway. The route that would take them past the Springwood Clinic, the last stop for travelers on the lost roads of addiction. It was now 9:23 a.m. The Subaru eased to a halt at the stoplight on the corner of Fairfax and Junction. Alice looked at the dash clock. 9:24. Neat. Despite heavy traffic, she was actually making good time. Chopin's Nocturne played softly on the stereo, and the plaintive piano music soothed her. Meanwhile, Marty Ballin rolled the bus down Junction and swore under his breath. Most of the cross streets were one way and headed in the wrong direction. At this rate, they were going to be an hour late at least, which meant he was going to be late over at the Peaks Diner to pick up Maybelle Rice, a fact that wouldn't endear him to the buxom waitress. No nookie for me today, he thought, resigning himself to the likelihood she wouldn't put out his punishment, even if he did have a legitimate excuse. While Ballin was thinking about emptying his balls, Buddy Newton was contemplating watching other people kick balls over the line. As coach for the Springwood Flags, Tuesday night was training time, and with his boys slipping in the Pop Warner League about their disastrous performance last season, he'd been riding their asses hard. As a young man with a promising NFL career ahead of him, he had trained religiously every day, refining his offensive moves until his 250 pounds of muscle and bone had been poetry in motion. Until that fateful day in 1963, 2 days before Kennedy died, wouldn't you know, when his dream had been as shattered as cleanly as the cartilage in his right knee, a gift from a nose tackle named Big Stump Rogers. 28 years later, he could still hear the sound of his leg breaking as his knee flared with a sunburst of pain. Feel the air rush from his lungs as Rogers, all 300 pounds of him, landed on his chest, cracking 3 ribs, putting him in the hospital for 10 days. Years of alcohol-fueled bitterness had royally fucked with his life, lost him his high school sweetheart, and wrecked a desperate marriage. Only the game had pulled him back from the brink of self-destruction. That, and a desire to see others achieve, even if he'd been denied the opportunity to show the world what he was made of. Those boys are going to get into shape one fucking way or another, he said to himself. He looked over at Floresu and Lindsay. Both of them were lost in their respective thoughts, as was the sick fuck they were going to fry, if they ever got back on the highway. Well, he guessed it didn't matter a whole lot if Razorblade Nuts clocked an extra hour of life. There was no way that sucker was going to see another sunset. Ray Floresu had his own guilty secret, and at that moment it was gnawing at his conscience like a mouse chowing on a tasty wedge of cheddar. His old man was slowly rotting away in an old folks' home upstate. Reeves Florescu's memory, bleeding out of his life as senile dementia, erased his gray cells. Ray hadn't had the courage to go see him, because coming face to face with someone you loved who no longer recognized you scared the living shit out of him, and he'd had terrible nightmares after the last time he'd visited the home. The smell of incontinence and disinfectant permeating his dreams. It was the smell of old people, old hopes, hanging in tatters like torn net curtains, old memories fading like sepia-tinted photographs. But most of all, it was the smell of death. Meanwhile, 9:26 a.m. clicked up on the dash clock as Alice put the car into gear and turned right onto Junction Avenue. There was a big, brightly colored poster decorating the bus stop, proclaiming that Walt Disney's classic animated version of Alice in Wonderland was coming soon to a theater near you, and the vivid imagery distracted her attention for a beat. Good. At least there was something decent she could take Jacob to see. "Welcome to Wonderland, Alice!" Rather than argue with him over why she wouldn't let him see the remake of Night of the Living Dead. "Rick, you little meatball." "Shut up," she said to herself, as memory traces broke the surface of consciousness like the tips of icebergs. It happened like this from time to time, and there was nothing she could do about it, even when awake. His evil voice would suddenly echo in her head, and she sometimes had to suppress the desire to scream. She assumed it was like having acid flashbacks, only these weren't hallucinations, these were real, and they hurt. "Shut up! Freddy's dead! Curtis Mayfield told me!" She managed a nervous laugh as she tried to concentrate on the traffic conditions. But deep in her heart, she knew it wasn't true. "Man, this sucks," Lindsay thought as he looked at his watch. 9:27 already, and the bald fart was leading them farther away from the highway. "Hey, Ballin, get this thing heading in the other direction. What do you think this is, a frickin' Sunday outing?" "Keep your hair on, pal," the old driver snapped. "It ain't my fault." Shit, he was dying for a cigarette, but prison regulations prohibited smoking on the bus. He turned to look at Stolenberg. At least their passenger wasn't giving them a hard time. In fact, the killer looked like he was in some kind of brain fugue trance, his eyes staring seemingly sightless into the middle distance. God, it gives me the creeps when he does that. Ray also looked like he was out of it, his attention not on the task at hand, as he gazed vacantly out the window. Probably thinking about getting his dick wet, Lindsay mused, glancing over at Newton and Danewood. Buddy had a mean grin on his lips as he stroked the shaft of his shotgun. Fucking Looney Tunes, that's what he is, no doubt about it. He'd never much liked the beefy guard whose sadistic impulses went a ways beyond clubbing an occasional prisoner when no one was looking. That dude's bad news, man. He shook his head. Danewood was absent-mindedly picking his nose and eating his boogers. Another one with a few cogs missing, he thought. Jesus, am I the only one here without some kind of problem? Next to Newton and Danewood, Stolenberg seemed almost normal, aside from the small fact that he'd killed a shitload of people, of course, and looked like something out of a cheapo horror movie. Although he'd read up on the case, it was impossible not to. Roadkill's exploits had been big business for the tabloids, and the killing spree had been a major media circus. Lindsay realized he knew little of the man they were taking to the chair. Sure, certain things had come out through the sleazoid press, like the details of Stolenberg's taste for cross-dressing and his passion for sex-change hookers, chicks with dicks, Hustler called them. And of course there were a lot of gory details about what he'd done to all those women out on Interstate 35, hacking out their ovaries with those blades of his and systematically mutilating their sexual organs. Man, it made him want to puke big time whenever he thought about it, which had been often over the 6 weeks Stolenberg had been locked up at Madison. And looking at the killer's cold face made him ask the million-dollar question he'd been asking himself for weeks. What turned a man into a monster? What made him do those things? Had Lindsay asked Stolenberg, he would have received a cryptic answer. because I am the Surgeon General. But the Surgeon General was on vacation. Whenever he was faced with a situation he couldn't handle or one that simply bored him, like the one he was in right now, he hated riding buses, and always had since he was a kid living in Waco, and had to ride the school bus for nearly 2 hours every day. Carl simply unplugged his mind and went into a state akin to dream time, as practiced by Australian Aborigines, only he called it walking the dead highway. He was on that highway as Lindsay looked at it, oblivious to the black man's attention, oblivious in fact to everything around him. Here on the barren stretch of Right Brain Freeway, he was safe so long as he stayed on the sunburned tarmac. If he stayed off and went wandering the wasteland, and sometimes he was tempted, he risked falling prey to the dust devils and sand demons that lived there, or the clutching, desperate arms of his victims, who writhed in their shallow graves at the side of the tarmac. And as always, he was searching for Dorothy and the yellow brick road that would lead him to peace. As a child, Carl Barrington Stallenberg had shown exceptional talents. The tragedy was, no one took any notice. Not his teachers, not his fellow pupils. He had no friends, and certainly not his mother, who spent her time doing one of three things, and sometimes all together: drinking scotch, screwing the Johns who kept her in cigarettes, lingerie and booze, and abusing poor little Carl, who unfortunately was the spitting image of his dead father, an amputee junkie who'd lost his legs after falling 2 stories out a window while trying to escape the 3 narcotics cops busting down the door of the squalid apartment he and his young wife called home. Carl had many talents. For starters, he had an IQ of 180, but no one knew this, as he displayed a mild form of autism that qualified him as some kind of idiot savant. He also had a brilliant ability to predict people's actions. While everyone ignored him, little Carl, who came to epitomize the saying children should be seen and not heard, watched and learned and watched, and what he saw was not very nice. From an early age he understood the world was an ugly place filled with ugly people, evil people, and that the most evil were women. If there was one thing his mother taught him, it was this: that love was a dirty word, a meaningless word that had been corrupted by the cancer of greed and hate and fear and denial. That fear was the strongest emotion known to man, and that women were the embodiment of fear, and that women were undeniably evil. This point was reinforced by Jorge Cushi, an old Spanish Oriental with whom he shared a cell in a Menard, Texas jail. Carl already knew this because of the treatment dished out by his mother, but if there was any doubt in his mind, Cushi's diatribes against the opposite sex soon squashed them like bugs hitting a windshield. Women were less than human in Cushi's eyes, and he knew first-hand experience. Like Carl, Jorge had suffered under the hands and belts and Zippo lighter of his Aunt Maria. To Cushi, women were a herpes scab on the lips of humanity. Carl certainly knew that score. From the age of 5, shortly after his father died of a heroin overdose, Carl's mother began to torture him. She would dress him up as a little girl, right down to making him wear an auburn wig cut in a bob style, tie him to a chair, and force him to watch the degrading things she did with men. "What's the matter, little Carl, scared?" And when she was really displeased with him, which was often, she would take the hot iron and burn his pale, shivering little body. Oh, Carl Stallenberg knew all about women, all right, but it was Jorge Cushi who taught him that sex with a man could be pleasurable, and was also the one who made him realize his true calling in life: to be the Surgeon General, cutting out the cancer of womanhood from the diseased body of humanity. But Carl had another talent, and this one had helped him retain a certain amount of sanity throughout his formative years. He was a lucid dreamer, and could control his dreams. Sure, he had nightmares like everyone else. No, not like other people. The dreams he had would send people screaming into the Arctic waste of total insanity, the type of place from which no one ever returned, confining them to padded cells. But he could always stay one step ahead of his demons. But the only dreams he couldn't control was the one about Mama, because that one was real. That one had happened too many times and, like the scars covering his back, had been burned into his psyche with the intensity of a welder's torch. But before discovering he could translate his lucid dreaming talent into the conscious state, Carl's only means of escape from the sordid, painful reality that was his life was to read. Nowadays, whenever he got the chance, he read everything he could get his hands on, fiction and non-fiction. He was an information junkie, pure and simple, and he now hungered for non-fiction more than make-believe. But in his childhood, fiction had exerted an irresistible gravitational pull over his imagination, especially works of fantasy like the Narnia Chronicles, the Lord of the Rings, John Carter of Mars, and particularly L. Frank Baum's Oz books, of which The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was his undisputed favorite novel of all time. In his skewed world view, Dorothy symbolized everything that was good and pure. He knew goodness existed. He'd seen it once or twice in his 35 years. That religious woman who saved all the children in poor countries, Mother Teresa, was definitely an angel. But he himself had found none on his endless journey across America, which was why he was still searching for Dorothy and the yellow brick road. He knew deep in his heart both she and it existed, and that if he could find them, he would be saved if she would let him join her on the way to the Emerald City. One day he would find them and his life's work would be done. That was one thing neither his mama nor these simpletons could take away from him. But mama had tried, oh yes, she had. Mama forbid him to read in the house, and while other kids were trying to smuggle copies of Playboy into their bedroom, he devised elaborate ways to hide his collection of well-thumbed paperbacks. No sneaking a peek at Miss December. Diseased bitches, all of them strippers and whores, and succubi every one. Or Miss April for him. Oh no, he was looking for Dorothy, his dear sweet Dorothy, in her red slippers. And as the prison bus moved farther away from the real highway, Carl Stallenberg was walking the dead highway, which was more real to him than the stretch of Van Buren the bus had traversed since leaving Madison Correctional Facility, still searching for the little girl who would grant him absolution. But something was wrong. The highway should be dead straight, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Yet he'd come across a sudden fork in the road, and now hesitated in rare confusion. Then it came to him. This was one of those crossroads where deals were made. Deals with the devil, as folklore had it. There was an inevitability about this stage of the journey that he had been trying to deny for days, and in doing so the nightmares had gained intensity. But now there was no going back. It was time for him to meet the Pizza Man. At 9:28, Alice halted at another stoplight and tried to suppress a sudden shiver. She switched off the air conditioning, feeling her stomach churn. Now what? The sensation was all too familiar. The world around her became unnaturally bright, every detail standing out in stark clarity. Time slowed for an instant, and the smell of the car's upholstery was overwhelming. Then she became aware someone was sitting beside her. It was Jacob. Her son turned to face her, and she noticed an ice cream stain on his Bart Simpson t-shirt. Ben and Jerry's Chunky Monkey, she thought absurdly. Then noticed the fear in his eyes, the eyes that belonged to an old man who has seen too much suffering, not the eyes of a 7-year-old. "He's coming, Mommy. He's coming back again, only worser. This time there's someone with him." "What do you—" A siren blasted behind the Subaru, distracting her, and then Jacob was gone. The black pool's surface began to churn, small waves dancing from the center. Then 4 blades sliced up through the brackish liquid, followed by a glove, a dark parody of the Lady of the Lake holding Excalibur. The arm to which the gloved hand belonged was clad in a dirty, torn red and green striped sweater. Then the bald, flaking head thrust forth from the choppy water, and Freddy Krueger cried out in jubilation, "Come on down, Alice! Let's have a party!" He strode toward the shore of souls and laughed, scratching his head with the blades. A large flake of skin came away like a fish scale, and he paused, looking at it.
Must get some, head and shoulders,
he muttered, then gave a dry chuckle, popping the slice of skin in his mouth.
Yummy. Nothing like a little brain food as an appetizer.
He walked toward the boiler room, chewing. Time to lay the table for the dinner guest, he thought, and laughed again. When it happened, Marty Ballin was looking for a sign indicating the detour back to the highway, half his brain fixed on the image of Maybelle Rice's heaving chest. Ray Floresu was still dueling with his conscience concerning his father and didn't see it. Neither did Les Lindsay, who was having one hell of a nicotine fit, bemoaning the fact he hadn't had time to drag on a Marlboro before getting on the damn bus. Jimmy Danewood was still mining for gold up his left nostril and thinking about buying his wife Sally Ann a complete set of lacy underwear from Fredericks of Hollywood, while looking at the back of Buddy Newton's head, half aware that the fat guard had a real bad snow frosting of dandruff on his shoulders. He didn't see it either. Buddy was thinking about the L.A. Raiders and the way they'd slaughtered the Miami Dolphins in last season's AFC divisional playoff, his gaze absently focused on a Haagen-Dazs shop on the right corner of Lang Street. Only Carl saw the Domino's pizza truck as it sped through the stoplight. He braced himself for the impact, clenching his teeth as the vehicle broadsided the bus on the driver's side, instantaneously pulping metal and flesh, twisting Marty Ballin into the dashboard and steering column, forcing the bus into the oncoming traffic. Then the bus rolled with an almighty screeching, thunderous crash as it tumbled to its side before the oncoming royal blue Ford Econoline van that collided head-on with the trashed cab, and Carl was flying across the aisle, landing heavily on Buddy Newton, and the lights went out. Alice glanced up from the dash clock and screamed as the blue van hit the bus, slamming on the brakes, spinning the wheel in an attempt to bypass its rear end, but failing. The Subaru's front off side clipped the van, flipping the car, and darkness exploded behind her eyes as her head hit the door frame, and reality winked out like a dead TV screen. Flesh for fantasy. Marty Ballin's eyes were gone, but he could still see. He didn't know they had exploded in a rush of aqueous humor during the impact, but that didn't matter. His legs were no longer attached to his spinal column, and he was unaware of that fact as well. All he knew was that he was suddenly in the Peaks Diner, and Mabel was walking toward him.
You're early,
she said, her voice surprisingly masculine, her large chest quivering tantalizingly as she walked over from the counter like some angel of mercy in her white uniform. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know anything.
Look at you. You're bleeding all over my nice clean floor.
He noticed the blood leaking from his sternum. Whose blood?
Don't worry. Aunt Mabel'll take care of you.
She reached out, hugging him to her heaving bosom. She was taller than usual. Maybe she was wearing heels, but that was dumb. Mabel hated wearing heels. He didn't care. He felt indescribably tired, and forgetting about the blood, lay his head on her pillows. But it was no longer Mabel holding him. He looked up into a man's face, a horribly scarred, burnt face, and opened his mouth to scream.
"Wanna kiss, sweetie?"
Freddy crooned, and he plunged his blades into the dying driver's back. Marty Ballin came apart like a ripe tomato.
"I see you had a real soft spot for her."
Freddy laughed long and loud, dropping the driver's torn body to the ground. Junction Avenue looked like Hollywood had decided to shoot a Stallone movie on Main Street without telling anyone. To call the accident scene chaotic was an understatement. Onlookers and store owners crowded the street, held back from the carnage by lines of blue police barriers. Patrol cars and 20 cops had sealed off nearly 2 blocks, as more and more people crowded into the area to witness death and destruction on an impressive scale, causing problems for the EMS trucks and the 2 fire engines needed to contain the blaze now raging in the Total Hair Affair beauty salon, ignited when a black Toyota MR2 had collided with the back of the Subaru. Altogether, 6 vehicles were involved: the bus, the pizza truck, the Econoline van, Alice's Subaru, the MR2, and a white Lincoln limousine that had been traveling behind the prison bus. Marty Ballin was dead, as was the Domino's driver and his female passenger. The driver of the Econoline was hanging on by his fingertips. Alice, Stallenberg, Newton, and Lindsay were all unconscious, but Florescu and Danewood were not so lucky, and were stunned yet awake, both men in terrible pain from their injuries. Ray's legs were shattered below the knees, and his right shoulder dislocated. Danewood wouldn't be picking his nose or jerking off with his right hand ever again, as it was trapped under the seat. Totally smashed. His collarbone was broken in 2 places, and 3 ribs were cracked. Add to this a bad concussion and internal bleeding, and it looked likely Jimmy wouldn't be around for much longer, if the EMS guys were unable to cut him speedily from the twisted metal.
Oh man, I'm hurting,"
Ray moaned.
My legs, sweet Jesus, I'm hurting."
Danewood groaned beneath him, partially covered by what was left of the seat, which fortunately kept Ray's full weight from crushing his busted rib cage.
"Help me, God,"
Danewood said softly, then coughed up blood.
"Jesus, sweet Jesus, please."
Ray's mind was screaming in pain as his pain skyrocketed up his legs, lancing his nerve endings with a small supernova of pain. He could smell gasoline, and his fear mechanism kicked in, taking the edge off the agony. His greatest terror was being burned to death, and through the shattered glass he could see flames spreading out from the front of the inferno that had once been the beauty parlor.
"Get us out! Get us the fuck out!"
he screamed, panic dousing the flames of pain consuming his legs. But the EMS crews hadn't reached the bus yet, and only one of the fire trucks was operational.
"Please, oh God, please let me get out of this," he begged. "Please, I'll go to church on Sundays. I'll go visit the old man. I'll do anything. Just don't let me be burned."
Then his consciousness started to slip down the muddy slope of shock, and he was floating in the dream pool. Alice was confused. She was on a deserted desert highway. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sand carried by a hot, dry wind stung her eyes. The road stretched on endlessly in both directions, and the landscape was bereft of life. It was totally barren. Not even a stray cactus stood sentinel within her range of vision. As if pulled by an invisible string, she started to walk, her mind as empty as the landscape, a halo of sand whipping around her head like a hive of agitated wasps increased. Carl knew he was unconscious, but his mind had been freed to wander. He was at one end of a long corridor, the kind you found in old institutions and asylums, and he didn't like it. He wanted to be back on the highway, out in the desert, not confined inside. He opened the nearest door on his right. The room inside was empty. He entered, heading for a door set in the opposite wall, flinched, because the brass handle that he grabbed was ice cold to his touch. He placed his hand on the knob again and twisted. It was stiff, and took all his strength to turn it. But the door opened, and he found himself staring at a brick wall. Les Lindsay opened his eyes to find himself in an empty movie theater. As a kid, the local cinema had been his home away from home, and he felt safe here, even if he didn't know where he was, didn't remember how he'd arrived. But sure as the Pope was Catholic, this wasn't your typical Cineplex Odeon. Scratches of light appeared on the screen, and a series of crackles and pops came from the speakers. Red letters set against a black background appeared, and discordant music filled the stagnant air. Too much treble, he thought, as the words, "Krueger International Pictures Present," appeared, replaced by a Fredericks of Hell production. The names meant nothing to him, and he frowned. Les knew every cheapo production and distribution outfit by rote: AIP, Hammer, Amicus, Independent International, and more. Another title appeared. I was a teenage nicotine addict. He laughed softly. Well, that was a new one. Maybe it was one of those campy takeoffs like Curse of the Queer Wolf or I Was a Zombie for the FBI. There was so much shit out there on video these days, it was difficult to keep up with each month's releases. Well, let's see what we have here, he thought, fumbling in his pockets for a... Buddy Newton opened his eyes and found himself on the sidelines of a football field. He shook his head. What a strange dream. Shit, he was still dreaming about taking that sick fuck to the chair. What the hell? Goddamn, must have drunk a skinful. He had no idea what time it was or how long he'd been waiting for practice to start, but the boys were late. The lights were on, flooding the field with fluorescence, keeping the dark night at bay. He stood up, suddenly aware he was still wearing his uniform. Boy, you are fucking up real good. Then, before he could take stock of his surroundings, a red and green ball landed at his feet. Carl, meanwhile, tried the door on the left, suspecting it too would be empty. It was. He didn't even bother going over to check the door on the far wall. Someone was playing games with him. Someone else was in control, and he didn't like that one bit. Alice stopped, turning to the right. Just off the highway, nestled into the ground, something moved, writhed beneath a layer of sand. A hand appeared, and she bit her lip. A woman's hand, the once finely manicured red nails broken and chipped. A second hand appeared, slowly clawing the hot air. The sand shifted and a head pushed up to face her. The woman opened her bloodshot, sand-coated eyes, then her mouth trying to speak, but she had no tongue, the torn root moving like a dying slug as a low moan crawled from her throat. Alice took a step back as the woman's torso emerged from the shallow grave. Her breast had been savagely hacked by a sharp instrument, and a thick brown coating of dried blood cracked and flaked as she struggled to free herself from the desert's clutch. Alice wanted no part of this. This wasn't the kind of nightmare she was used to. There were none of the familiar Elm Street reference points, and she knew then she was lost on someone else's reality map. Fear scratched the back of her neck with frosted fingers, and she ran. In his 10 years on the Springwood Force, Sergeant Will McDonnell had seen some terrible auto accidents. But this one bit the biscuit clean in two. The Domino's pizza truck was so heavily impacted into the front of the prison bus, it was going to take the EMS guys at least 4 hours to cut the drivers' bodies out of the wreckage. Both were as dead as a duck in a skeet chute, and so was the teenage girl who had been riding in the cab. They'd managed to identify her as Marie Berganza, the 17-year-old daughter of the driver, who died on impact, her head cracking open like an egg when it hit the sidewalk. Poor baby, what a way to go at such a young age. As far as the EMS guys could tell, there were 4 other men trapped in the bus, one of whom was alive, hysterical, and kept asking God to save him from being burned as he slipped in and out of consciousness. Well, that sure wasn't going to happen now. The fire at the beauty parlor was under control, and once they got the other goddamn fire truck pumping water, it should be out within minutes. Somehow, the driver of the MR2 that had caused the blaze, some big-shot lawyer from Washington, D.C., from what he'd gathered, had gotten away with a few cuts and bruises, just like the driver of the Lincoln. But he wished he could say the same for the Ford driver, who was hanging on to his life with little hope. Still, at least the guy's wife was alive. She had multiple fractures to her legs, pelvis, and ribs, the medics had said. And the woman in the Subaru, which had clipped the Ford's tail, appeared in one piece. She was out cold, though, and the senior medic seemed worried about a fractured skull. "Well, lady, you might lose a few brain cells," he said to himself, "but if you come around, you're going to be in far better shape than some of these poor folks." Alice ran and ran. Her breath came in short gasps as she fought against the rising wind, swatting her hand in front of her eyes, trying to keep the dust from blinding her. There were other dead people trying to crawl from shallow graves, hundreds of them, mutilated people without end. Some, those who still had tongues and vocal cords, would cry out as she ran past them, their voices following her, dancing on the wind. "Help me! It's so cold. Give me back my ovaries. Oh, come to me. I'm not dead. Who buried me?" She covered her ears to shut out the litany of confusion, pain, and rage, tears beginning to flow from her eyes, washing away the sand. She thought her battles with Freddy had been bad, but this was worse, far worse. She felt a silent scream building inside of her head, and for the first time in her life, Alice, who had witnessed the deaths, no murders, of friends and loved ones, fought the evil that was Freddy Krueger and won, felt the boat of her sanity start to come loose at its moorings as a sandstorm of madness washed over her in a hot, dry tsunami of death and blood and mutilation as she ran a marathon down the highway of the dead. Les Lindsay was too tired to take any notice of his instincts, which kept flashing a warning sign inside his head that something was wrong about the theater and the movie. The only thing bugging him was the cigarette pack was empty, and he was dying for a smoke. He wondered vaguely if there'd be a cigarette machine over by the concession stand, just like there used to be before all the multiplexes banned puffing in the auditorium. But the movie was riveting, and he couldn't leave the show. Gary Conway from I Was a Teenage Frankenstein was playing a sadistic prison guard who reminded him of Buddy Newton, but without the fat, who liked to systematically beat a prisoner who looked remarkably like Anthony Perkins in Psycho, but who was named Carl. Stallenberg? Wait, who's Stallenberg? And kept protesting his innocence. He couldn't make head nor tail of the plot. It was like one of those Jess Franco women in prison flicks, only with men, and William Shatner, yep, good old Captain Kirk himself, played the warden, a racist son of a bitch, just like the one he played in I Hate Your Guts. Gary Conway kept beating Anthony Perkins, who was now starting to look like Ray Fluorescu, and then Shatner informed him it was time to go to the chair. The dialogue was exceptionally bad, but it was certainly more fun than watching reruns of Star Trek any day. Carl decided to open every door just in case. Whoever was playing games with him didn't appear to have much imagination, and he was starting to grow tired of this bullshit. He tried the fifth door down on the right. Same shit, empty as a student's refrigerator. Then, as he turned back into the corridor, he saw the white armadillo and did a double take. On his frequent journeys down the dead highway, Carl had seen some strange things. Once he'd seen a perfect pink daffodil growing on top of a rock. Another time he'd seen a small blue rabbit dressed in a red waistcoat hopping over the sand dunes. And strangest of all, he'd once had a conversation with the talking skull that said it had been Charlie McCarthy in another life, which was obviously a crock of shit because Charlie McCarthy had been Edgar Bergen's ventriloquist dummy and was as wooden as they came. Still, it wasn't often he had the chance to discuss the implications of Cartesian dualism with anyone, as truckers, his fellow interstate travelers, couldn't manage to get their retarded brains around anything more complicated than a woman's measurements or how to replace a busted fan belt. But the conversation with the skull had come to an abrupt end when the chunk of bone had coughed an attitude after he called it Yorick. Geez, some folks just had no sense of damn humor. But the white armadillo, now that was interesting. He was sure he'd seen it run from one doorway to another. Least it looked like an armadillo, but then he'd never seen an armadillo running upright on its hind legs before. "Well, turn on a roll, son. Check it out," he said to himself, and headed down the hallway. The EMS truck carrying Alice and the broken body of Ray Fluorescu, who was barely conscious, pulled away from the curb with a screech and a flash of red lights. The driver hit the siren and started to cut a high-speed swath through the congested traffic. heading toward Springwood Oaks Medical Center, as Will McDonald watched the other medics pull the bodies of Carl Stollenberg and Buddy Newton from the bus wreckage. Lindsay followed, carried tenderly on a stretcher, as two other men used an oxyacetylene torch to cut Danewood free. "What a goddamn mess," he said to the chief medic. "Yeah, but we're lucky most of these fellas are alive. If you can call being smashed to smithereens alive," he added. "There's a good chance they'll pull through, just so long as a couple of them can come out of their comas." "I don't know, Hoss. If I was smashed up like that," McDonald shrugged. "Sometimes I think dead is better." The movie was starting to get real interesting, but Lindsay felt stuck between a rock and a hard place. He didn't want to miss a second, but he was having the worst nicotine fit of his life. Everyone in the movie smoked incessantly, and it was making his lungs itch. Now the plot was starting to make even less sense than before. Half the cast of High School Confidential, including Russ Tamblyn, Jackie Coogan, and Mammy Van Doren, were wandering in and out of scenes like the projectionist had got the reels out of order. Maybe he had got the movies mixed up. No, he couldn't have. The scenes were shifting too fast to correspond to reel changes. And by God, wasn't that Bruce Dern as the drug-crazed hippie brother of Susan Strasberg from Psych Out, standing behind William Shatner, chain-smoking Marlboros? Yes, it certainly was. Weird fucking movie, man. It was no good, though. He was going to have to locate a pack of butts. Fighting his tiredness, Les forced himself up out of his seat and stumbled up the aisle toward the theater's rear. Flash of the blade. Jimmy Danewood was a happy man. Sally Ann stood before him wearing a red and black lacy bustier, garters and red fishnets, black high-heeled pumps, and black micro panties. As usual, the bedroom was a mess, which meant she'd been sitting around all day watching General Hospital, The Guiding Light, and all those other shitty soaps she was addicted to. But for once he didn't care. Somehow she'd read his mind and gone and got that Fredericks of Hollywood's outfit he'd been thinking of buying her. "Better your money than mine, sweetheart," he thought, absent-mindedly picking his nose with his left pinky finger as she smiled at him. "What do you think, honey?" she said, slettily chewing a mouthful of gum. Looks great, baby. How about giving old Jimmy here a kiss?" "Well, I do declare," she said, playing the Southern Belle to a T. "I hardly know Mr. Jimmy." She placed one hand on her hip and beckoned him with a slender, long, red-nailed finger. "Let's see what kind of gentleman Mr. Jimmy really is. I'm tired, and I don't think I can make it to the bed." Jimmy stood up from the clothes-strewn chair, sneaking another pick of his nostril as he played bashful and looked at his feet. "Well, Miss Sally Ann, let's see how that old bed feels. Mr. Jimmy's kind of tired too, you know." "Not too tired," she said, her voice dropping an octave. Must be coming down with another sore throat, he thought as he sauntered over and swept his glamorous wife up into his arms, putting on a little weight there too, he added, straining as he lifted her up over to the bed. He put her down and hopped on beside her, kicking off his unlaced boots. "Get rid of the gum, Sally Ann, and give me a soul kiss," he crooned. "But it's your favorite," she said, wrapping her arms tightly around his chest. "What, grape?" "No." She chewed and chewed. "Boogers! Ha 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 ha!" she added, her voice suddenly deepening. Jimmy blinked and went red. "Think I like watching you sit in front of the TV set, snacking on your snot?" Her voice was deeper still, unmistakably masculine, her fine bone structure seeming to crawl beneath her skin. "You're a disgusting booger eater, Jimmy Danewood, and you deserve to be punished!" Sally Ann had grown incredibly strong, and her skin was starting to bubble and flake as she rolled on top of him, pinning Jimmy to the bed. He blinked fearfully, and the ugliest man he'd ever seen was leering down at him. "How about a soul kiss from the real boogeyman?" And the ugly man with the burned face plucked thick green and gray bolos of chewy snot from his mouth and popped it into Jimmy's. He started to gag, to struggle against the man's arms and body weight. His mouth was filled with oozing, gummy mucus, and he gagged again. "Wanna dig for gold?" Freddy growled. Krueger raised his gloved hand, the blade splashing in the light before the hand descended to hover an inch away from Jimmy's face. "You know what they say! You can pick your friends, and you can pick your nose, but you can't pick your friends' noses," he said, slipping a blade up the left nostril and straight into Jimmy's brain. Leper Messiah. Alice was exhausted. The wind had died, thank God, but the dead people were still stumbling down the highway behind her, their entrails dragging on the tarmac, slashed limbs hanging loose on tattered strips of skin. "Save us!" the nearest man cried. "Our Savior!" a woman moaned through torn lips. "Give us peace!" a girl dressed in the ruins of a red miniskirt beseeched, her remaining breast flapping against exposed ribcage as she stumbled behind an overweight eyeless woman. Alice grabbed her hands over her ears. "Shut up! Shut up! Leave me alone!" Exhausted, she started to run again. Into the lungs of hell. Les was as happy as a pig in shit. He'd found a cigarette machine outside the men's room and was contentedly dragging on a Marlboro as the strange movie continued to unspoil. Robert Vaughn and David McCullum had joined the cast as Napoleon Solo and his Russian sidekick from The Man from UNCLE investigated the murder of an undercover agent at the prison. Les had loved Uncle as a kid, and a warm wave of nostalgia washed over him as Vaughn and McCullum, complete with slimline 60s suits, questioned William Shatner in his office. Bruce Dern was still sitting around smoking a big fat joint this time, but no one seemed to take any notice of him. Then Shatner asked if they wanted to go watch the execution, and Vaughn said yes. The scene shifted to a gas chamber, and Ray Floresu, Anthony Perkins, it was true, Ray did look like Perkins, was strapped into the chair. A tall, real ugly dude dressed in an old red and green sweater stood behind him as Shatner explained to Napoleon Solo that they were going to smoke him to death. The executioner in the ratty sweater pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket and started stuffing them into Ray's mouth. Only it wasn't Ray anymore. It was him. He was on the screen. Les sat up suddenly and dropped his Marlboro. It was him! What? The executioner started to sing, "Light my fire," in a hideous off-key voice, and turned to face the camera as he continued to fill Les's mouth with a full pack of smokes. "Don't try this at home, kids," he said. "No ifs and no buts," and lit the cigarettes. Screen Les started to choke, and real Les suddenly found himself short of breath, a terrible pain filling his lungs. "Try Krueger brand cigarettes." The executioner held a pack before the camera. Light glinted off the 4 cigarettes rising from the package. "It's like cookies for your lungs." Ha 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 ha! Screenless jerked in the chair, fighting frantically as he struggled against the restraining straps. Real Les clutched at his throat, his fingernails gouging skin as he tried to breathe, but he couldn't breathe. His lungs were on fire, his chest crying out in cellular agony as his lungs blackened and swelled. Then his ribcage exploded. in a spray of blood, carcinogenic tissue, heart, and esophageal tract, and then both versions of Les Lindsay dissipated in a cloud of ash. Crawling from the wreckage. "He's a goner," said the medic as his partner finished cutting Jimmy Danewood's body from the wreckage. "One less bed needed at the hospital." "How many's that altogether?" the other medic asked. "4, I think, but the way those other boys looked, I think there's going to be a bunch of dead guys partying down by the morgue tonight. Want to place a bet?" "Sure, how many?" "I'd say another 4. "You're on," the other medic said, pulling Andrew Jackson from his pocket. "I'm in for 20. Midfield.
Hey, Coach, let's see you move.
Buddy whirled, startled. 3 linemen dressed in red and green uniforms stood on the 50-yard line. One of them growled. "Who the fuck are these guys? What fucking team is this?" Nothing made one shit of sense.
Come on, Coach, let's see some of that old Newton magic,
said a 4th player standing off-field. That guy ain't no linebacker, he thought instinctively. Too damn skinny.
Go for a touchdown, rah, rah, rah.
The skinny player started, waving a pair of pom-poms, looking like the ugliest cheerleader Buddy had ever seen. Were those pom-poms heads? The 3 players at the other end of the field hunkered down, preparing to charge him. And he picked up the ball without thinking how fucking stupid this was, how there was no way in hell he could run to the line with a shot leg. But they suddenly charged, and Buddy had no choice. He ran away. Pain lanced his leg from ankle to hip, and Buddy grimaced. Then he was down, kissing AstroTurf, his body hurting like a shitstorm as the players piled on. The world spun with dizziness, and he was vaguely aware. Oh, motherfucker, something broke inside. He was being pulled upright by the arms, his back arching.
You're the 4th one down,
shouted the skinny guy, who started running toward him. "Ah! Fucker's gonna hit me!"
"So, it's time to punt!"
Krueger added as he kicked Buddy in the throat, kicking his head off his body, up, up, up and over the posts.
"Oh! It's good!"
Catch my fall. Alice was limping. She'd lost her right pump somewhere down the highway, and her heel was bleeding on the hot road. At least the dead people had stopped following her and the wind had died completely. But now she had a new threat, the sun. It was hot, so hot, too hot. Need, and her throat was as dry as parchment. Water, her breath scouring her tongue as she panted. "Got to keep going," her mind insisted. "There's got to be a way out of here. There has to be. Water." She continued trudging along the tarmac, her eyes half closed against the glare.
"You need water.
What?
Water. I can lead you to water."
Now I'm hearing things, she thought.
"No, even if you did try to kill me."
The voice sounded like Minnie Mouse, but very faint.
"Don't be rude. I heard that. I'm a mosquito, not a mouse. Some people have no manners."
Alice opened her eyes. Turning her head, she saw a mosquito, the size of a butterfly, following her.
"Yes, it's me,"
said the mosquito.
"the one you spread all over the Rand McNally this morning."
"I'm sorry," Alice replied,
"but you were gonna bite me. We all need to drink, Sugar Plum, and all I wanted was a little of your blood."
"I'm sorry, really I am," Alice mumbled, weaving across the road, her eyelids drooping.
"No hard feelings. Anyway, just to show you I'm not one of the bad guys, I'll take you to water. Besides, there's someone who wants to meet you. By the way, my name's Pierce. What's yours?"
"Alice," she mumbled, staggering now.
"Of course,"
said the mosquito.
"Come this way."
It flew off the road toward the faint shape of an adobe hut in the distance. If it hadn't been for the mosquito, Alice would never have seen the small single-story building nestling against the far scrub. It was a simple structure, constructed in classic New Mexico style, its walls bleached white by the never-setting sun. She saw as they drew nearer, her eyelids increasing in heaviness as the merciless heat flayed her nerves.
"We're nearly there,"
buzzed Piers the mosquito, and indeed they were. One thing she'd learned on her desert marathon was that distance and perspective had no meaning here in this god-forsaken place. What seemed far was actually near. What was near far. This played havoc with her already fragmented consciousness, but Alice was past caring. All she wanted was to float in a clear swimming pool. She opened her eyes. They were there. She leaned against the door frame, pushed against the rough wood, and collapsed inside. No one's leaving. Carl was trying to find the armadillo when he found the boy. He pushed open the door to the 7th room on the left and stopped in his tracks.
"Hello?"
said the small boy with the big eyes.
"Are you a bad man or a good man?"
"Well, son," said Carl, doing his best John Wayne impersonation, "I guess I'm one of the good guys, but a lot of people don't see it that way."
"Oh,"
the boy said softly. "What's your name, little amigo?"
"Jacob."
the boy replied, nervously fingering his t-shirt.
"What's yours?"
"Most folks know me as Roadkill, but you can call me Carl."
"Are you a friend of Freddy's?"
"Who's Freddy? The pizza man?" Jacob nodded. "Shit on toast, son. No way, Jose."
"Good,"
Jacob said, looking down at the face of Bart Simpson. Then he looked up, and Carl took a step back. The kid's different-colored eyes were old, cold, and a threat of violence lurked in the blue and green of the irises.
"Are you gonna hurt my mommy?"
Carl paused. "Before I answer that, I'm gonna ask you a question. Does your mother beat you?"
"No."
Jacob replied, his face hardening. Young at heart.
Who are you?
Ray Floresu looked into his father's face, and what he saw there chilled his heart. There was no recognition at all.
It's me, Dad, your son Raymond. I don't have a son, never did,
the old man replied, staring out the retirement home's window at the rose bushes near the wall.
Dad, please try to remember it's me, Ray, your son.
Reeves Floresu continued to gaze out into the garden.
Dad, please. I've never seen you before in my life,
he replied, turning to face him.
But you're young, you'll do.
What did he mean? Damn it! Dad was getting worse, and Ray's heart was heavy with guilt. I should have come to see him sooner.
Anyway, young man, I want you to meet my friends.
Ray turned to the doorway. 3 old people stood there. 2 women and a man who was considerably younger but who had a bad complexion.
Come in, Reeves Floresu said cheerfully. Come join the party.
Isn't he nice and young?
The blonde woman said, squeezing Ray's bicep as she walked past him.
Yes, strong looking,
said the other, a floozy redhead wearing too much makeup, as she too moved into the room, going to sit beside Dad. The man with the bad complexion leaned against the doorframe, sniggering.
So, Ray, come home to roost,
he said, scratching his chest through his red and green sweater.
This place is for the birds. Come over here, boy, Dad said. Sit with us a while.
Ray did as he was told, and the old women reached out, one squeezing his thigh, the other his arm.
Lots of meat on him,
enthused the redhead, stroking his leg. Man, old people could be so strange.
Gotta watch out for the buzzards,
the man cawed. Ray didn't like the turn the conversation was taking. Something weird was going on. He felt someone was playing a joke on him, but he couldn't guess the punchline. He looked to Dad for reassurance. Nada. Dad did kind of look like a bird of prey. His nose looked larger, and it had always been a beak at the best of times. It's just an optical illusion, he told himself. His nose looks bigger because his cheeks are so sunken. Yet the two women were also taking on a withered, vulture-like appearance. Their noses definitely hookish and protuberant.
It's feeding time, Ray,
the man in the doorway said, then broke into song.
and birds of a feather flock together.
Talon-like hands grabbed him, tore at his shirt. He fought back, lashing out to catch the redhead across the beak. Nose! She squawked and Ray recoiled. The feeding frenzy started, and Ray Floresu felt his life force being sucked up like coke through a straw as he was overwhelmed by clawing hands and the smells of perfume, disinfectant, and stale piss drops.
Nevermore! Nevermore!
Freddy cawed, but Ray couldn't hear him. The carrion birds had taken his ears. The last thing he saw was the man pull his hand from behind his back, a hand wearing a glove with long thin blades, and flipping the bird. Then they went for his eyes. Cry for love.
Drink this,
said a voice Alice did not recognize, as cool liquid touched her lips. She took a mouthful and choked.
Slowly, slowly.
She tried again. This time the water made it down her throat.
Take it easy,
Piers buzzed. She opened her eyes and started. She was laid out on a dirty mattress in the adobe, her head resting in the lap of a man of indeterminate age. She could tell he'd been handsome once, only now he looked exactly what he was, a withered drug addict. As she turned to get a better look at her benefactor, she recoiled, spilling the glass of water he held close to her cracked lips. He has no legs, her mind screamed, and Alice realized her head had been lying on one of his weathered stumps, the thighs truncated a foot below his hips.
It's okay, I won't harm you. In fact, you need me, just like I need you. Look, I bathed your feet, bandaged your wounds.
and he's giving you these nice red slippers,
the mosquito interjected. Alice saw the shoes beside the soiled mattress. Yes, they were nice. They reminded her of someone, a girl from Kansas with a little dog. Only she was from Wisconsin, and it appeared she had a pet mosquito instead of a dog.
There's work to be done,
Jerry Stallenberg said.
but do you mind if I shoot up before I explain?
He stuck the syringe in a pock-marked vein and sighed before she could say anything.
Time's short and I've got a lot to tell you, but I find a fix clears the mind.
Then he told her about his son, and he cried as he did so. The undefeated. We've lost another one, Doctor, the nurse lamented as Ray Floresu's life signs flatlined on the visual display.
We're not doing too well tonight, are we?
The nurse shook her head.
Let's see if we can at least keep our two dreamers alive.
There's no reason why they shouldn't. Aside from whiplash, the girl's in good shape, and Stallenberg hardly has a scratch on him. Still, if they don't come out of their comas... She let the rest trail off. Dr. Locke knew the score. The patients could be kept alive indefinitely if the next of kin so desired. It was expensive, and she saw no point in it herself, but some people lived in the vain hope their loved ones would revive from vegetable land and wake up like Sleeping Beauty. Yet as days turned to weeks to months and the seasons changed, hope usually dried up like an Oklahoma dust bowl, blown away on a wind of escalating medical bills. Keep your eyes on them at all times, Dr. Locke said as they walked down the corridor toward the room in which Alice and Carl lay. Beat me at the first signs of life, if any, he added. Can't hardly wait. The dinner table was laid for 7, and most of the guests were already there. Freddy, however, was pissed. The two VIPs were late.
"Tea for 2, 3,
he said to what remained of Buddy Newton's decapitated corpse.
but no crumpet for the strumpet." "Alice, you're late. You're late for a most important date."
He chuckled and took off his hat, placing it on Marty Ballin's head.
"Who's gonna be the Mad Hatter? You?"
Marty, of course, said nothing.
"Nope, not mad enough. You?"
he said, pointing a blade at Jimmy Danewood's vacant face.
"No,"
he added, lifting the cranial plate he'd opened like a tin can, peering inside to look at the empty space.
"Not enough brains. What about you? Or you?"
He pointed to Ray and Les, then shook his head.
"No heart, no courage. So that just leaves me."
Waiting for the man. Jacob led Carl to the last room, leading off the corridor. "I think he's here," the boy said earnestly as he peered up at Carl as he opened the door. "About time, too," the white armadillo snapped. "I was wondering how long it'd take you." He looked at his pocket watch. "Late. Much later than I expected." Stallenberg stood in the doorway dumbfounded, a feeling he rarely experienced. There before him sat a large, white, honest-to-God armadillo, wearing a Stetson, cowboy boots, and a brown leather holster, swinging its tail behind it. "Well, aren't you gonna say hello to your old buddy?" the mammal said. "Joe Bob? That really you?" Carl had astonishment writ large across his uneven face. "Who do I look like? Mae West? Yeah, it's me. Only I've changed since you last saw me." Years before, Carl couldn't recall how many, he'd kept a pet armadillo when he and Karen had set up a home outside Austin. But the damn thing had gotten itself creamed by a truck one day, and he buried it in the backyard. Since he loved the damn thing more than the bitch he'd married, Joe Bob, the Dillo's passing, had grieved him deeply. "What happened to you? How'd you get so big?" "How can he talk, you mean?" Jacob added. "Toxic waste," Joe Bob replied, "like them Ninja Turtles." Carl looked at him like the Dillo had just spoken in Japanese. "I forgot. You don't read comic books. Not intellectual enough for you." Jacob smiled at the joke. "I see you've made friends with my buddy here, Jake," the Dillo said, and pointed his tail at Jacob. "Good. Then we're all set, Pilgrim." He waddled over to the door on the far wall. "Except for one thing," he added, pulling something from his holster and tossing it to Carl. "You'll be needing these." Stallenberg reached out quick as lightning, plucking the arm strap from the air. His blades! God damn, he had missed them. "Tool up, pardner. It's time to meet the Wicked Wizard of the Id." Joe Bob opened the door and stepped through, into the asylum. "If you want blood, you got it." Jerry Stallenberg told Alice everything. How at age 14, Carl finally ran away from his mama and joined a carnival, apprenticing himself to Zorro the Great, a master knife thrower. How when he was 17, he returned home to kill Mama with the deadly wrist blades he'd fashioned from 3 razor-sharp stilettos attached to a spring-loaded device connected to a leather arm guard of the sort worn by metalheads, and how, after gutting the bitch, who had tortured him for years, he became a nomad, wandering the length and breadth of America in search of peace and goodness. How down on his luck and starving, he held up a grocery store and ended up spending 2 years in jail for armed robbery. How in Council Bluffs, Iowa, he met a girl called Karen, who said her name was Dorothy and that she was from Kansas. That she was really an ex-hooker from Reno, Nevada, on the run for fleecing a mafia boss out of $50,000, most of which she lost in a succession of sleazy bars and cheap motels. Carl, he informed her, was so sure he'd found his true love that he trusted her with his soul and believed every word she said, until the day he caught her with her sugar daddy, an obese 70-year-old carpet millionaire from New York City, who'd met her on his way to Palm Springs via Houston and decided to live out the last days in Austin, with her ministering to his needs during the day while Carl worked 12-hour shifts in a computer factory. How his son had gutted Karen, chopped her up in small pieces, burnt the remains, and then shot the millionaire in the head and made it look like suicide. How Carl Stallenberg heeded the words of a prison friend called Jorge Cushi, had a religious experience in the middle of the Arizona desert after consuming a large dose of mescaline, and had been reborn as Roadkill, a motorized angel of death who scoured the highways of the Southwest like a surgeon, slicing the organs of women from their bodies and generally having a fine old time. Then he continued, when the police in Texas got wise to his activities along Interstate 35, Carl headed north to Seattle, Washington, where he changed his modus operandi, put his blades into temporary retirement, and continued to kill over 40 hookers and runaways, dumping their bodies in such a way that he became known as the Green River Killer. Then returned to Texas in late 1983. Here, Jerry said, Carl met two drifters named Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole, who also killed a bunch of people, and how he got royally pissed when Henry, arrested on a weapons charge, later confessed to dozens of Roadkill's murders and was rewarded with a strawberry milkshake every time he successfully identified a crime site. How after killing 257 people in 15 years, Carl had finally grown tired of entrail slinging and was desperate to find the real Dorothy and go off with her down the yellow brick road to the Emerald City to find eternal peace and happiness, which was where Alice came in. "You see, you are the real Dorothy, Alice," Jerry deadpanned as he heated up another fix of smack with something extra. "You might not know it, but you're a real angel, a good angel, and only you can bring him home, grant him the peace that poor little son of a mine so desperately craves. He knows he's done wrong, and he's ready to make amends, deep down in his heart, and if you want to send that scumbag Krueger back into the depths of hell where he belongs and get yourself a life, then my Carl's your boy." He sighed. "I wish I'd been a better father, but hey, there's a price you pay for everything you do. This is my penance, sitting out in a God-forsaken desert until the end of time shooting horse." He paused, refilling the syringe. "You don't think I enjoy this, do you?" Alice shook her head no. No, she didn't believe Jerry did, but she was starting to wonder if she was ready for a rubber room. She felt a million light years away from Springwood, as if she'd woken up one morning to find herself cast in a Z-grade version of a David Lynch movie, written and directed by Larry Buchanan, the Poverty Row movie maker responsible for Zontar, The Thing from Venus, a stupid movie Steve revered with juvenile glee. "Don't feel badly toward my Carl. He's just a little messed up in the head, and if you knew his mama, you'd understand and tell him I love him when it's time to go."
Speaking of which,
Piers droned.
"I know it's time, but take this with you,"
He said finally, handing her the syringe.
"You'll probably need it."
we're late, we're late.
The mosquito buzzed, flying to the door. "Why?" Alice questioned, holding up the syringe.
"For Freddy, a little gift from me. Smack cooked up with holy water and laced with strychnine. Ought to fuck him up real good."
The real thing. Joe Bob opened the door, and the three musketeers found themselves in the Arkoff department store's kitchen section. "Well, I guess we're not in Kansas anymore," the armadillo said as it inspected a General Electric chest freezer. Carl smiled. "You remember. I feel like the wonderful Wizard of Oz is tattooed in my brain. The number of times you read that damn book to me," the mammal replied, closing the door. Carl looked sad. The memory of sitting in the backyard reading the book to his pet was tinged with bitterness. Thinking of Austin reminded him of Karen the cunt, and that made him want to kill something. "So where the hell are we?"
"The Elm Street Mall," Jacob replied. "We're really on his turf now."
"This is, Pizza Face's kingdom?" Carl frowned. Jacob nodded.
"It's where the house used to be. I think it's where he killed the children."
Carl went white. "He's a kid killer?" Jacob nodded. "Son of a fucking bitch." "He wants you, boss," Joe Bob said. "I don't know why, but he does." Carl picked up a chair and threw it across the kitchen set. It smashed against a microwave on the counter, shattering the glass. "I'm gonna get you, asshole!" he screamed. "Chill out, buddy," Joe Bob said, placing a paw on Carl's shoulder. "You want to let him know we're here?"
"He wants your souls,"
Jacob said. Carl turned to him, incomprehension clouding his brow.
"The souls of your victims. He needs them. He's weak, used up. That's why he's trapped here. He doesn't have the power to enter the real world anymore, but he can pull people into his void, and he knows we're here."
Jacob's attention shifted from Carl to a point behind him, and both the armadillo and the killer turned to look. The girl, 6 years old, and dressed in white, was leaning against a table in the adjacent kitchen set. She placed a finger coyly to her lips and pointed at Joe Bob.
"You look funny," she laughed. "And you look ugly," she added, pointing at Carl. "But you look nice." She pointed at Jacob. "What's your name?" "Jacob," he answered. "Will you come play with me?" He shook his head no. "Freddy's gonna punish you." She punctuated the comment with a high-pitched laugh, and then she ran off, which was when the lights started to flicker. Heartland. "This is it,"
Piers buzzed as he flew around Alice's head.
"The yellow brick road."
The dirt road running off of the highway was yellow, but didn't look anything like the one Judy Garland had walked down on an MGM backlot, Alice thought.
"I wish I could come with you," he added, "but I have to stay. My role is over."
"Why?" Alice was starting to enjoy the little insect's company.
"Because I can't, that's all. Anyway, remember, if you get into trouble, just tap your heels together 3 times and say, 'There's
No place like home. I know. I've seen the movie," she chuckled.
Good. Now run along, young lady."
Piers flew off, and Alice suddenly felt very, very alone. Toys in the attic. Joe Bob, Jacob, and Carl descended on the escalator to the floor beneath the lingerie department and ran into the first of Freddy's surprises. The Kids R Us consumers toy section was a war zone. Joe Bob stopped in his tracks, his tail jerking as he stepped back, nearly squashing Jacob. "Sorry, amigo." Jacob ignored him as Carl shook his head in amazement, lifting the boy so he could see the whole insane panorama. 2 4-foot-high transformers were fighting over Barbie, who was cowering next to Ken. Only Ken's head was missing, his plastic body spasming on the floor as his girlfriend wept. It got worse. A platoon of G.I. Joe dolls were engaged in a vicious knife fight with Charlie Brown's Snoopy and the rest of the Peanuts gang, hacking, stabbing, punching, and kicking. One G.I. stabbed Linus in the mouth as another drop-kicked Pigpen, stuff leaking all over the place as the soldiers fought with insane glee. Over toward the climbing frames and slides, a certain well-known mouse was doing something obscene to a large pink hippopotamus. "Shit on whole wheat," Carl exclaimed, covering Jacob's eyes. "You sick son of a bitch." Innocence had been corrupted, and he felt as mad as a bull facing a red flag. "Don't you look, son," he said as he set Jacob down, turning him away from the disgusting display of interspecies lust. He flexed his wrist, popping open his blades. Isolation. It seemed like she'd been walking for days, but she honestly had no idea how long it had been since she first set foot on the yellow brick road, or how far she had traveled, the endless bright daylight disorienting. But one thing was certain, the landscape was changing. Flat, dry scrub gave way to imposing mesas and deep arroyos, and the mountains that had seemed so far were suddenly so near, and she felt very small. In fact, she knew how Frodo had felt as he entered the Ash Mountains of Mordor in The Lord of the Rings, but she kept going and going. Later, though how much later she had no idea, she realized the sky was darkening.
"When you reach the Black Sierras,"
Pierce had told her as they went back over the desert toward the dead highway,
"you'll know you're nearly there.
"Where?"
In his territory. And it won't be very nice. Whatever you see by the roadside, remember, stay on the road."
She'd asked him for specifics, but the mosquito refused to speak. Now she knew why. It was getting unusually cold. Not a physical coldness, but a terrible spiritual cold.
"Krueger, you bastard. I'm really gonna make you pay for this,"
she said as she saw the first house on the corner of the next bend. It was a New York brownstone standing incongruously on its own, its 19th century facade a bizarre contrast to the natural hostility of the rock wall behind it. The house was in darkness except for a light in the top left window. Curiouser and curiouser, she thought as she continued on her way. Round the bend was a second house, also on the right, and this one looked even more out of place than the other. This was a suburban English house of the sort she'd seen in the Monty Python sketch, the one where John Cleese was doing his funny walk down the street. It was a 2-story detached middle-class house with net curtains in the windows and a neat garden in front. Only all the flowers were dead and the grass was scorched black, as if an intense fire had raged across the ground. As she passed it, the front door opened, and a man appeared, an incredibly ugly man.
"Why, hello, little girl," said the man with no nose. "Would you like some candy?"
His face was as red as a lobster, and was pockmarked with angry yellow pustulating boils which oozed viscous fluid. He had a nasty accent, a charcoal gray suit, and a slightly stooped manner that made him look like a subservient office worker.
"My name's Peter Curtin. What's yours?"
"Alice?" she said before she could stop herself.
"Alice, sweet Alice, would you like a drink? I have some fine blood, type O, from a virgin girl."
He grinned and she saw his teeth were filed into points. "No!" she snapped, walking away. The man's smile shattered.
"Come back, you bitch! Come back, I want you! You come back!"
Alice covered her ears with her hands, walking at a brisk pace. It was getting colder and darker. Alice stopped dead. "This sow is mine!" the fat boy shrieked. "No, she's mine!" squealed his twin, and Alice grimaced. The Jankowitz twins, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, stood before her clad in red and green sweaters with matching caps. To prove his point, the first one that had spoken pulled a knife from his back pocket, a red and white Swiss Army penknife, and fumbled trying to open it. "That's really tough, Brian," she said. "Or is it Neil? Doesn't matter." The fat kid, acting mean, went as red as his sweater as he frantically tried to open the multi-instrument. "You're both a couple of overweight snots." "You got it wrong, lady," exclaimed the other twin, a .44 Magnum in his hand. "Vet for the insane." The stuffed toy was at Jacob's throat. Its claws no longer felt, but thorn-like material that threatened to tear skin, slice arteries, as Carl dove for the creature, his blades ready to rip. Only Carl was gone and Roadkill was in his place, ready to protect the innocent, ready to operate, and he did. The blades took the bear in the back, penetrating synthetic fur, soft stuffing, ripping out cuddly toy viscera in a snowstorm of fluff and guts. The possessed plaything screamed, a high-pitched whine as it died, Jacob coughing asthmatically as the pressure on his throat was relieved, and Roadkill, scourge of the highways, doyen of death, bellowed in berserker rage. Joe Bob, meanwhile, was holding his own, playing Godzilla as he swatted G.I. Joes and demonic Care Bears left, right, center, 1, 2, 1 with his tail. Jacob struggled to his feet as Roadkill tore the remaining stuffed toys to so much fluff. "Steady on, boss," Joe Bob said, trying to sound jovial as he waddled over the thrashed toy bodies. "The battle's over, we won." Reasoning with Roadkill was an impossibility. Once the storm broke, Carl just had to ride it out. He tore into empty toy boxes, trashed broken transformers, dead bears, and a certain mouse that offended his sense of dignity. Then and only then did the stillness return, until Freddy's voice boomed over the public address system.
Time for tea! The cozy candy forever!
Last exit for the lost. "Enough of this crap," Alice screamed silently, her surprise and apprehension exploding with anger. "You're gonna get yours, Krueger, I promise." Her mind reverberated as she took off with the front kick, which connected with Tweedle-whatever's wrist, pointing the gun barrel at his brother as he fired, and Tweedle-whoever's face exploded as the bullet took him under the left eye, spraying cranial matter all over the yellow brick road. "No!" Tweedle-gun screeched. "Yes!" Alice answered, spinning around in a crescent kick, taking out the fat kid's legs, sending him down heavily on his flabby ass. As she completed the move, her eyes widened. The angle of his fall meant the gun was up at 45 degrees, the barrel pointing slightly to the right of her face as she sensed the muzzle flash before it, and blackness claimed her. The fear of fear. The Three Musketeers descended into the bowels of the Elm Street Mall, heading for the boiler room and a dinner date with Destiny. Despite his calm exterior, Jacob was afraid. He may have been 7 going on 40, had faced Freddy before, but he wanted his mommy. "Why aren't you here?" Wanted to be back in Wisconsin with Yvonne, watching cartoons, going swimming, playing with toys and kids and eating ice cream. "Mommy, where are you?" And doing kid stuff, not walking into Hell's Lounge with a serial killer and a talking armadillo. "Mommy, why don't you answer me?" And he was afraid, very afraid. He wasn't the only one. Joe Bob was filled with sadness, fear, and a terrifying sense of inevitability. He knew he wasn't really 6 feet tall, wasn't in fact really real. He was an adjunct of the dream world, an essence that lived because Carl, his master, wanted him to live. And after he'd been splattered by that truck and Carl had buried him, his little armadillo soul had gone to the other place, which Carl called the Dead Highway, and he'd wandered the tarmac, rolled in the scrub, rooted around in the arroyo, neither in armadillo heaven nor hell. But now his time in dream purgatory was nearly over. He'd be leaving soon for parts unknown, would ramble down a different highway alone. He was sad and scared. Joe Bob knew he was going to die. Carl, too, felt fear grip his scrotum with cold hands, a woman's hands. The scar tissue on his back itched like the long, scratchy fingers of the Wicked Witch of the West. "Please don't hurt me, Mama." They were gouging his flesh, and the part of him that was eternally 7 years old, just like the Jacob boy, protect him, was terrified. Going down into the darkness of the boiler room was like being locked in the dark place, shivering, waiting for Mama to come with the hot iron and whiskey on her breath. But Roadkill was angry. His dark half wanted blood, and that made Carl dangerous. Near death. Steve arrived at the hospital as, on her bed, Alice spasmed, her EEG reading jumping frantically, hitting 9.5 on the Richter scale of brainwaves, sending Nurse Swabby and Dr. Locke into a panic. "Hold her down," he said, as the two of them tried to keep Alice's jerking body from rolling off the bed as she had a seizure. "We're losing her," the nurse cried, seeing Alice's readings drop to flatline status. Her heart rate slowed to an imperceptible level, the line approaching horizontal. "We can't be," Locke snapped back. "There's too much brain activity." Alice's body convulsed, her right arm moving spastically, pulling the IV feed from her vein. Rose Garden Funeral of Sores. Freddy leaned against the dinner table on which Jimmy Danewood's brain lay on a silver platter like an Arab delicacy, and welcomed his guests.
Well, well, the gang's nearly all here. Would you like a spot of tea?
He gestured to the silver pot standing next to the brain.
Or an appetizer?
He raised his right forefinger, the blade catching light from the flaming boiler, then sank it into the pile of cranial matter, scooping up a moist morsel.
My new diet. No brain, no gain,
He muttered.
Or shall we wait for the Death Day girl to get here?
Save the shit, pizza man, Carl drawled. Let's do it. Just me and you, mano a mano.
Look who crawled off the highway. I've been waiting a long time for you.
He shifted his attention to the boy as he walked around the table.
Come and give your Uncle Freddy a kiss.
Jacob stepped back behind Carl.
Oh, no? What's the matter? Miss your mommy? But you...
Freddy turned suddenly to Joe Bob, pointing his glove at the armadillo.
You're not welcome. No dog meat.
As his echoing voice faded, Ray Florescu's desiccated corpse stood up, knocking over his chair, his sightless eyes making him look like an old man lost in senility. Les Lindsay also stood, the remains of his exploded lungs hanging open on his chest like an accordion, his stomach and part of his small intestine curling out over his crotch like a fat woman's bulging uterus.
Cookin' boys! Let the games begin!
Helter-skelter. Alice spiraled down through endless dark, a pure white light blast of pain ricocheting behind her eyes, and then she landed hard. Her insides cried out in protest as she lay on the cold floor of the asylum corridor, trying to put the jigsaw pieces of her consciousness into a cohesive picture. "I'm back, and you're gonna pay, Krueger," was the first thing she thought. Then she picked herself up, wiping the blood from her forehead wound where the bullet had creased her brow, and staggered down the corridor toward the door she sensed led to the boiler room, her right hand clutching the syringe. Love me tender. For a couple of dead guys, Ray and Les moved fast, but then Freddy was in control and could make what was left of them do whatever he wanted. Before Carl could respond, the zombies were on Joe Bob. The armadillo squealed as dead hands grabbed him, pulling him away from the others.
Suey, piggy!
Krueger cried, rushing the mammal, his blades ready to slice. The knives penetrated soft underbelly and sliced upward as easily as a hand moving in a bowl of porridge as Krueger gutted Joe Bob from crotch to throat. "Joe Bob!" Carl bellowed. "No! You son of a fucking bitch!" Jacob looked away, gagging. Dillo guts dropped to the floor like hot, wet coils of bloody rope, the mammal's body tumbling backward as the dead guards let him go. Carl rushed to Joe Bob's torn body. "Little buddy! Oh!" The words stuck in his throat as he kneeled down beside his fallen companion, tears in his eyes. Freddy laughed long and loud, the evil noise reverberating around the boiler room.
No use crying over spilled intestines! Ha ha ha!
Jacob scowled at the Nightmare Man. "You're gonna die, asshole," Carl snarled. "See these?" He held up his own set of blades. "You're dead meat, pizza face."
But how can you kill someone who's already dead?
Krueger taunted, seating himself on the table and knocking what was left of Marty Ballin off his chair. The corpse hit the ground with a soggy thud.
How clumsy,
he muttered.
Besides, Carl, or should I call you Roadkill? If you kill me, You'll kill part of you, he continued, lifting his torn sweater. We're brothers, under the skin.
Jacob had seen Krueger's pulsating torso before, but it still made him feel sick. Carl, however, had not, and the sight made his eyes bug out as he saw the stigma of the child killer's legacy. Freddy's skin writhed with the faces and partial body forms of his victims. A young girl's features pushed forth from his abdomen, the mouth open wide in a silent scream of pain and confusion, then melted into that of a young man Jacob recognized from one of the 2 photos his mommy kept in place on the bookcase at home, his Uncle Rick.
You carry your victims in your head. I wear mine with pride. But it hurts, Carl, doesn't it?
He paused for effect, standing up from the table.
I can give you peace. Share what's yours, and I'll share what's mine.
Carl's face dulled, and Jacob sensed a change come over the man who had saved him from the homicidal toy. Something inside him is listening, he thought. Something bad, rotten, wants what Freddy has to offer. The realization gripped his frail child's body like an arm wrestler's hand.
But there's one thing I need you to do for me,
Freddy added. Alice in hell. She played this game before, but now Alice was sick of it and mad as hell. The corridor grew longer the farther she walked, its perspective expanding to seeming infinity. She started to run, but the corridor increased its length, the doors on either side strobing on the periphery of her vision as she ran and ran, her wounded foot throbbing with pain, her bruised skull aching like the onset of a migraine. Then something tripped her, and she landed hard on her left shoulder, oxygen whooshing from her lungs in a rush, the syringe falling from her hand. Looking up, she saw dozens of Krueger's fathers emerging from the cells, and her mind wanted to shut down. Not again. No, not this again. She'd been through Amanda Krueger's rape at the hands of 100 maniacs once before, and the sense of being torn apart had permanently affected her ability to relax during sex, another stress area in her relationship with Steve. The maniacs advanced, eyes glazed with insanity and lust, hands reaching to caress the air in front of them, fingers desperate to touch flesh. "Get out!" her mind screamed. "Get up, girl, run!" She scrabbled for the syringe while looking at the advancing maniacs. Her fingers found it as the first of the lunatics touched her, tearing her blouse as he grinned mindlessly. Risking a glance to see if the syringe was intact, she scooped it up, pushing herself from the grasping hands. Cloth tore, and she ran like the wind. Mind over matter, she told herself, focusing on the door at the end of the corridor. "I'm there! I am there!" The corridor appeared to shorten. "The door is here! The door is..." The corridor compressed, and she slammed into the metal door, and pain exploded in her already aching left shoulder as... Beyond the realm of death.
I want you to kill.
Alice in the door burst inward as Krueger spoke.
Alice!
Both Jacob and Carl turned to face the noise. "Mommy!" the boy shouted, his face lighting up with hope.
Well, look who's finally here. Malice in Wonderland!
Krueger grimaced. "Mommy, be careful!" Jacob shouted. Alice held up a hand to silence her son. "Didn't you know, Krueger? Freddy's dead." The Nightmare Man laughed.
Oh, that's rich, bitch. Says who?
"Curtis Mayfield and me, you bastard." Krueger chuckled.
Black humor, bitch, he hissed. But your timing's never been better.
"No, don't!" Jacob cried, grabbing hold of Carl's legs. But Carl was gone, only roadkill present. He swatted the kid away with the backhander, sending Jacob across the room.
Go to it! Shred her!
Freddy growled. Roadkill advanced, and Alice went cold, forgetting the syringe in her hand. The consciousness that was Carl Stolenberg screamed silently as it was eclipsed by the darkness that was Roadkill, the Surgeon General, who legislated against the diseased bitches who were a blight on manhood. He saw Mama Karen taunting, flicking back and forth. Karen in the hotel room giving head to an obese old man. Mama standing over him with the hot iron. Roadkill advanced on the petrified Alice.
Show's over, bitch!
Krueger spat, hawking a mouthful of mucus, spitting the black phlegm onto Buddy Newton's slack face for effect. "You're mine," Roadkill said, coming nearer, raising his blades. Jacob looked around desperately for something to throw at Carl. He sensed Freddy was in the man's mind, making him advance on his mommy. "Gotta stop him, gotta..." Then he saw it. When Krueger had dragged Floresu into the dream pool, the guard's nightstick was still attached to his shattered body, and now it lay on the floor near the boy, shaken loose when the zombie guard had gone after Joe Bob. Jacob crawled over toward the stick, careful not to attract Freddy's attention. "You make me sick, you little shit," Mama said. "He's better in bed than you are," Karen said. "Time to take your medicine, Carl," Mama wheezed with whiskey breath. "He doesn't dress up in women's clothes like you, limp dick," Karen laughed, and Roadkill felt the rage upon him. Jacob picked up the heavy nightstick and hurled it with all his might. It hit Carl on the base of the spine and Mama Karen dissolved. The woman standing before him was neither of his tormentors, but she was still a bitch, and bitches needed punishing.
What the?
Freddy growled as he whirled toward Jacob. "The red slippers!" the boy shouted as Carl shook his head, shaking off the stars of concussion. "She's wearing the red slippers!"
Red slippers.
He blinked, shook his head again.
Dorothy, the real Dorothy, stood before him. His Dorothy. Oh, no fucking way!
Freddy screamed. "It's time to go to the Emerald City, Carl," Alice said, seeing tears appear in the scar-faced man's eyes, as though he were melting within. Carl shook his head again. It was her. She was here.
You little shit!
Freddy moaned as he lunged after Jacob, who disappeared beneath the table. Carl turned to face Freddy. "Wrong move, asshole," he drawled, raising his blades. "Let's see if you can cut it in the big league." Carl Stallenberg ran at Freddy blades high, his face a rictus of rage, legs pumping as he launched himself across the room. Freddy was in a half-crouch, still reaching for Jacob under the table when Carl connected, his stilettos penetrating Krueger's back, puncturing diseased lung and corrupt viscera. Krueger screamed, turned and slashed his glove across Carl's face, transforming it into a Venetian blind of skin and cartilage, one of the knives slicing his left eye horizontally in two. But Stallenberg continued to fight, even as a curtain of blood descended over his right eye, pulling back his arm, thrusting his synthetic claw into Krueger's sternum. Freddy cried out and slashed down, stripping one of Carl's legs to the bone. Stallenberg felt his life flowing out of him as his eyesight dimmed, but Roadkill, all pure wrathful vengeance sinking instinct and rage, took over, jerking his arm back for a coup de grace. The three stilettos came down hard, ripping into Krueger's throat, and the scourge of Elm Street wheezed blood and pus and surprise as Carl collapsed. Alice removed her hands from her eyes, the syringe still held tightly in one fist as she heard the body hit the floor. She could see poor Jacob curled up under the table, eyes shut, hands over his ears, as Carl's body twitched on the ground as if in the grip of an epileptic seizure recorded at half speed. Freddy was jerking around next to him, an inhuman noise escaping his punctured body. Alice ran toward him and drove the syringe into one of his eyeballs. Freddy screamed, "Oh, no!" and screamed fit to wake the dead of 2,000 years, screamed like nothing Alice had ever heard, and she felt the fight, all trace of energy to stand leave her, felt herself falling to the floor. "Hold on," her mind cried. "Press the plunger." She did. her legs folded, putting her down beside the bloodied body of Carl Stallenberg. Krueger jerked, bucked, twitched, convulsed, and went still. She could hear Jacob weeping as Carl's hand found hers. "Dorothy," he groaned through ripped lips, partially severed vocal cords. "I love you. Take me home." With the last of her strength, she lifted her head toward what remained of his face. Kiss me." Love My Way. Steve was arguing with Dr. Locke when both men heard an almighty crash come from the room behind them. "What in God's name?" the doctor exclaimed as they pushed through the door. Carl Stallenberg, who for the past 2 hours had lain in a coma, as lifeless as a stuffed eggplant, lay curled up on the floor in a fetal position beside Alice's bed, his hand in hers. Glass from his shattered IV drip coated the floor, and his EEG machine screamed in flatline, the electrodes swinging free from his body. "Alice!" Steve cried as he pushed past Dr. Locke, who ran to Stallenberg's body, checking his pulse. The killer was dead. Alice opened her eyes and blinked. Where am I?" she asked. Steve reached for her hand. The end. Okay, Slashaholics. This was the conclusion of Freddy Krueger's 7 Sweetest Dreams, Dead Highway, Lost Roads. And I gotta say, my only complaint with this entire story is I would rather this have been a full-fledged 300 to 400 page novel. I mean, think about it, guys. We could have had a whole lot more of of Alice and Pierre the Mosquito on the journey to find Freddy. Meanwhile, we would have had the 3 Musketeers over there, Jacob, Carl, and the White Armadillo, Joe Bob, on their adventure, you know. More stuff could have went down, and then maybe a bigger climax and everything. But I really feel like this story, although it was an awesome short story and I really enjoyed it, I just feel like if it were fleshed out into like a full novel, it would have been an amazing novel. Like, I would have enjoyed it better than Suffer the Children. And that's my opinion. What do you guys think? Because I really enjoyed this book, or this short story. Enjoyed the characters. Even though Carl Stallenberg is a piece of shit serial killer, I was still rooting for him. Don't know why, but I was. You know, his backstory did make him a little sympathetic. And I wanted him to defeat Freddy, and it was cool how he took up for Jacob. I had fun voicing a slow-talking southern armadillo and a quietly buzzing mosquito. You know, that was fun. The Freddy scenes were amazing. The Freddy dreams and the Freddy kills were awesome and were right there in line with the Freddy we know from the movies. I give this short story a 10 out of 10, guys. I don't have one problem with this short story other than the fact that it was a short story. I would have rather this been a full-fledged novel. In fact, if somebody were to take these characters and do like a fan fiction 300-page novel or something, I would narrate that on the channel. I would love to read it. If anybody out there is listening that would want to take on that type of writing gig, go for it. But yeah, guys, let me know in the comment section if you enjoyed this short story. I think it was the best one in the book, personally. What did you think? And also, would you like to see this short story fleshed out in full novel form with all the characters and the potential story that could be told? Alright guys, let me know in the comments section. I'm looking forward to it. And this was the last story left in the book for me to narrate. I'll be putting out the unabridged version soon with a commentary at the end where I'm going to talk about each short story individually. But yeah, guys, this was an awesome anthology book. It had a few misses in it, but a lot of hits, like really good ones like this one. Until next time, guys, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
Pleasant screams!
In the dark of the night, with tales of horrific might, Josh spins his airy weave in the stories we believe. Freddy's in my dreams, Chucky's silent screams, Jason's lurking near, Michael feeds the fear. I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. Eyes and masks and pain, blood runs like the rain. Evil finds its way in spine-chilling fray. Out of breath but not out of light. Horror digs, don't look behind. Feel the terror crave. Will you dare to slave? I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. Final destination's here. Every death's a newfound fear. Pulled to madness year by year. Josh's words I always hear.